you might have to accept it, but.
Okay, great. So, welcome everyone on this evening of September 17th, 2025. As the summer has raced by and we're moving into that wonderful fall season. I want to welcome you all on behalf of the sponsors of this evening's webinar, namely the Campaign for Peace, Democracy, and Common Security, and the Peace in Ukraine campaign of Massachusetts Peace Action. Tonight, we're very honored to have as our presenter, George Beebe. As many of you know, George is Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute. He spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including his time as director of the CIA's Russia Analysis, director of the CIA's Open Source Center, and as staff advisor on Russian matters to Vice President Cheney. His book, The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe, which warned how the US and Russia could stumble into a dangerous military confrontation, is an important book to read. I believe it was published in 2019. And just to note that George speaks both Russian and German. So George Beebe, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Looking forward to what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Paul, and thanks for the invitation to speak to this group. I want to talk a little bit about what I think is going on, and just to remind people that a year ago, we were struggling to get anybody in Washington to agree that a negotiated compromise settlement to the war in Ukraine was necessary. This was a time when the United States was focused on essentially forcing Russian capitulation through a combination of very stringent economic sanctions, by isolating Russia diplomatically in the world, refusing to engage with Russian officials, and through providing sufficient military aid to Ukraine, not just to defend Ukraine against the Russian invasion, but to inflict such losses on the Russian military that Vladimir Putin would essentially conclude that the costs of this invasion far outweighed the benefits, and he would simply end the invasion. Now, that strategy didn't work, I think, and we're now in a situation where we have a president that has said, yes, there should be a negotiated end to this war. That is a significant change in and of itself. And it has, I think, greatly changed the international context within which this war is now taking place. Now, the question now that we face is not, should there be a negotiated end to this war, but how do we bring this about? What is the requisite combination of diplomatic engagement and flexibility, or willingness to compromise on some issues, and the backbone and resilience to stand up for things that we really shouldn't compromise over? And how do we bring Russia, Ukraine, our European allies, and Washington, D.C., much of which still remains unconvinced that a negotiated settlement is a good idea, on board with a negotiated settlement and all this? So I want to talk a little bit about where I think things are. Now, it's easy in reading the press to come away quite pessimistic about the prospects for a settlement. You hear that Putin isn't at all interested in peace, that he simply wants to prosecute this war on the battlefield to the point where Russia wins. You hear that the Ukrainians won't compromise on any of the key territorial issues that are in play in this war. You hear Europe insisting that there has to be some kind of European military presence on the ground in Ukraine in order for this peace to be durable. And you hear Russia saying, no, we reject that. So it's easy to come away with the impression that these issues are simply irreconcilable. There isn't a lot of room for compromise on all of this. And I will offer a contrary opinion. I'm actually relatively optimistic that we are on the path toward a compromise. And it's not a compromise that everyone's going to like. It's not one that's going to be easy to pull off. But I think progress has been made, much more significant progress than one would believe reading mainstream media coverage of what's going on here. Now, before I get into why I think that we've made more progress than most people understand, I want to talk about two contrasting ways of understanding this war, of diagnosing what is at stake and what the problem is. Because how you diagnose this problem matters a lot to your prescription. If you get the diagnosis wrong, your prescription is going to fail. And the diagnosis that I think most people in the West accept is that this is a war a lot like World War II, a lot like what happened when Nazi Germany decided it was going to invade Poland and France and, fill in the blank. In other words, an aggressive, autocratic bully state that has decided that it covets land that is right now across its border. And it is going to prosecute an aggressive war of imperial expansion until it meets some sort of firm military resistance. Now, the prescription that flows from that diagnosis is exactly the prescription that the Biden administration applied for 3 years, which was you have to convince the bully state that this aggression is not worth it, that the costs exceed the benefits, that it's not going to succeed in this imperialist aggression, and that in attempting to, it will actually damage its own interests. Now, the alternative diagnosis of the problem is one that I subscribe to, and it actually produces a different prescription for how this war ends. My alternative diagnosis of the problem that we're facing is that it looks a lot more like a World War I problem, a problem in which all of the countries involved thought they were taking defensive steps to enhance their own security. But those defensive steps prompted alarm on the part of their rivals and neighbors, which kicked off a cycle of action and reaction in which everyone thought the other guy was the aggressor. Everyone thought they were acting out of defensive motives. And eventually they wound up in a confrontation that none of them actually wanted or expected. Now, international relations theorists call this the security dilemma. And I think that is the situation that we're facing with Russia, one that is not something you read a lot in mainstream media accounts of this war, but one that I think resonates with the Russians on all of this, who think that they are fighting a war to secure their Western flank against an expanding Western military alliance, NATO, whom they don't trust and whom they regard as having aggressive intentions toward Russia, and whose alliance with Ukraine, or alternatively, whose ability to put NATO military forces or bases on Ukrainian territory is one that the Russians regard as an existential threat to them. Now, you don't solve a World War II problem by negotiations. And you hear this a lot when you read mainstream media coverage. People talk about Munich and how appeasement made the problem worse. And if we try to negotiate with Putin, it will only convince him to continue his aggression, to conquer all of Ukraine, to move beyond Ukraine into NATO territory itself. We cannot reward this aggression. It will only, if we do, fuel future aggression and will eventually get into a military conflict. So the time to take a firm stance on this is now. But if your diagnosis of this problem is erroneous, if in fact you're facing a World War I style problem, that prescription makes it worse. More coercive power, more military resistance actually deepens that cycle of insecurity and of action and reaction that makes the prospect of escalation of this war greater, not worse. And what we're seeing playing out right now, I think, in our public discourse and to some degree in discussions between the various players that are involved in this war, is really a debate over what kind of problem are we facing. Now, many of our European allies are absolutely convinced that this is a World War II problem, that Russia is like Nazi Germany. It has to be resisted militarily. The United States has to be involved in that resistance. So they're trying to rally the Trump administration to double down on even more military support for Ukraine, loosen restrictions on the kinds of weapon systems that we're willing to provide to the Ukrainians, give the Ukrainians the ability to strike at strategic targets deep inside of Russia, combine that with even more onerous tariffs and sanctions on Russia, put secondary sanctions on India and China. And this approach will convince the Russians at long last that this just isn't worth it. And they will essentially say uncle and say, time to end this war, which they could do at any time simply by withdrawing their forces and stop fighting. Now, I think the Trump administration has essentially said to Ukraine and to our allies, that's not the kind of problem we're dealing with. This is a problem that can only be resolved through compromise. And that doesn't mean we compromise on core issues, things that are of vital importance to Ukraine, to European security more broadly. But it does mean we have to distinguish between things that are absolutely essential for us to achieve and things where we can afford to compromise. Now, why do I think I'm relatively optimistic about this? I think it's because we've started to compromise on what I regard as some of the core issues that this war is being fought over. The first is a geopolitical tug of war between the United States and Russia over Russia's place in Europe's security architecture and Ukraine's place in Ukraine's security architecture. The United States and NATO have been attempting to pull Ukraine into the Western alliance. The Russians have been trying to block it. There's been a tug of war over whether Ukraine will be east or west. And what we've seen over the past few weeks is the United States and Russia have outlined a compromise on that issue. We're splitting the difference. The United States has indicated, I believe, to the Russians that we are willing to prevent Ukraine from becoming a member of the NATO alliance. And we are willing, depending on what the Russians are willing to concede in return, to acknowledge that we're not going to put NATO military forces on Ukrainian territory. Now, the Russians, in return, and this is something that's gotten very little press attention, but deserves a great deal of attention, the Russians have said, okay, in return, we will not block Ukraine's future membership in the European Union. Now, back in 2014, after the Maidan revolution in Ukraine, this was something that was a central issue that the Russians were absolutely opposed to. The prospect that Ukraine might join the European Union was one that they said, no, that's a red line. But now we're in a situation where it looks like both sides are saying we're comfortable with Ukraine being militarily neutral, not part of the NATO alliance, not part of any alliance with Russia or any other country, but politically and economically aligned with Europe. Now, to me, that is a way of addressing what Russia regards as its core security concerns that are at stake in this war, but also provides Ukraine with a path toward future economic prosperity and European political processes and values. In other words, a situation very much like what Austria found itself in for much of the Cold War, where it was militarily neutral. It was by treaty banned from joining any military alliance, but it became a part of the European Union and, in fact, prospered. It was a great thing for the Austrian people to be in that kind of situation. And I think this does offer hope for Ukraine's future, in which it can be secure but reconstructed and on a path toward democratic reform and economic prosperity. Now, I think there's also indications of flexibility on territory. And this is something, again, you don't hear a lot about in Western media coverage. But a year ago, in June, President Putin made a speech in which he laid out Russia's goals for this war. And he was very specific that Ukraine had to withdraw all of its military forces from the 4 regions in Ukraine proper. And I'm leaving Crimea aside for this because I think it's a unique situation. But this would be the 2 Donbass regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, and Kherson and Zaporizhia. Now, Russia occupies some of that territory, but not all militarily. And Putin insisted that Ukraine had to simply vacate those territories in their entirety as the basis for ending this conflict. Now, what happened in the last several weeks was Russia fell off of part of that territorial demand. They're still demanding that Ukraine vacate the remaining portions of the Donbass. It's about 25% or so, maybe a little less, of Donetsk province that Ukraine now occupies. But Russia said that it would simply settle for freezing in place the current military lines in Zaporizhia and Kherson. This is highly unusual for Russia in its negotiating behavior. Usually, Russia does not make concessions early on in a negotiating process. They tend to hold very rigidly, some people would say stubbornly, to maximalist demands until they see the very end of a negotiation in sight. And then they make the minimal concessions that they think are necessary to get the negotiation to a deal. In this particular case, they have made a territorial concession without, at least as far as I can tell, getting anything reciprocal in return. And they're doing this relatively early in a negotiating process. I think that's a very strong signal that is being sent, that they want a deal, that they're serious about a negotiation. Now, again, you don't read that in mainstream media coverage. For several reasons. One is that people have fallen into the trap of conflating an unconditional ceasefire with a peace deal, and they're not the same thing. The Russians are indeed opposed to an unconditional ceasefire, in which they simply say, okay, we're going to stop fighting, and then hope maybe we get terms in a negotiated settlement that we find suitable for our purposes. The Russians are not willing to do that. The primary leverage they have in the negotiation is the progress that they're making on the battlefield, and that progress is continuing, and Ukraine's position on the battlefield is eroding over time. So the Russians aren't going to ease up on that pressure, and in so doing, ease pressure on the Ukrainians and the West, their backers in this war, to compromise on things that the Russians believe they need some real compromises. But that doesn't mean they don't want to deal. And this, I think, is a critical pivot that the Trump administration engaged in over the past couple of months. Early on, Trump was seeking a quick deal, an unconditional ceasefire, simply getting the two sides to stop shooting at each other, stop the killing, as he put it, in the hope that that would then facilitate a deal, but it would be an early achievable win for Trump that he could point to and say, see, I told you I was going to stop this war, and look what I got. You know, they're not shooting at each other anymore. That issue, that approach failed. It failed because the Russians felt that they would be sacrificing leverage in agreeing to that. The Russians urged Trump to engage on the key issues that they saw at stake in this war, and Trump eventually said, okay, you were asking me to engage on the core issues that are involved in this war. I'm going to do that. And the Russians said, okay, we'll engage. We will do that. And that has, in fact, been going on. You saw that in Alaska. But those negotiations are continuing behind the scenes. And my information is that they are making progress. In other words, I think the U.S. and Russian positions on ending this war are a lot closer than most people at this point presume. Now, what yet has to be done? I think the biggest obstacle that we've got right now is actually Europe. Europe that does not want Russia involved in European security matters for reasons that go well beyond their diagnosis of what the cause of this war really is. Part of this is that Europe finds Russia a convenient foil for bringing unity to a Europe that would otherwise be riven by some fairly serious internal tensions, and uniting against a common enemy is something that they find politically very useful right now. Second thing is they don't want this war to end because this is a way of keeping the United States engaged in NATO, an active player in European security matters, which they find useful both for their own security and because they like the idea that the United States will be their security umbrella. It relieves them of having to make some hard choices about their own resource allocations inside Europe. But I think here again, we are making some progress. It is not as fast as I think many people would hope. But I think the Europeans are beginning to realize that they really don't have good alternatives to a compromise settlement of this war. Trump played a dangerous game in the past couple of weeks. He said to the Europeans, we're not going to put secondary tariffs on India and China for their purchases of Russian oil unless you, the Europeans, do that too, and unless you stop buying Russian oil. And the Europeans have looked at that and said, they blinked. There was an article in the French paper Le Monde yesterday indicating that they've decided that they're not going to put those kinds of sanctions on India and China. They can't wean themselves of Russian oil that quickly. Those kinds of steps would be potentially fatal to Europe's economy. So that really isn't an option right now. And I think they also realize that putting combat forces on the ground in Ukraine is also not an option. And part of what we've seen in the last few weeks is a war of words between Russia and Europe over this prospect, where the Europeans are talking about putting a coalition of the willing on the ground in Ukraine to enforce a peace deal and serve as some sort of tripwire against a future Russian invasion. And the Russians have said, no, that's not acceptable. That is not something that we will agree to as part of a peace deal. We find that threatening to Russia's own security. Now, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte then issued a statement saying that Russia doesn't get a say on this. Russia has no voice in whether Europe and Ukraine agree to put European forces on the ground in Ukraine. Well, the Russians had a response to that, I think. And that response played out with these drone incursions that you've seen in the news over Poland and Ukraine. These were unarmed drones. This was not an attack on NATO. They had no military targets in mind. But I think they were a signal. And I think that signal was to Europe. And the signal, if I will translate that into English, was, if you think we don't have a say over whether Europe puts combat forces on Ukrainian territory, think again. We do have a say. It'll either be at the negotiating table or it will be through military force. Don't imagine that we won't attack those forces if you try to put them on the ground in Ukraine over Russian objectives. So I think the Europeans are starting to realize that there are real limits on their alternatives to a negotiated compromise. Now, there's still a ways to go on this, but and I don't expect that there's going to be a fully fledged peace treaty that is going to be concluded anytime soon. A full peace treaty is going to involve a lot of technical issues that are going to take a long time to hammer out. It's going to have to include a roadmap toward arms control negotiations, nuclear arms, strategic nuclear arms, theater nuclear arms, conventional forces in Europe. That is one of the issues that is at stake in this war in Ukraine. We're going to have to agree to enter those negotiations. They're not going to conclude anytime soon. Laying out the terms and provisions of a peacekeeping operation is going to take some time. Economic reconstruction is going to take some time. The thorniest issue is going to be getting Russia to accept a reasonable approach to Ukraine's self-defense capabilities. The Russians are going to want to limit the Ukrainian military to pretty small and incapable forces. Obviously, that's not acceptable to Ukraine. It should not be acceptable to the United States and Europe. Russia is going to have to acknowledge that Ukraine has legitimate self-defense requirements. That means the Russia is going to have to swallow that the West will provide arms and training and maintenance for the Ukrainian military so that it can defend itself, even though we're not going to go to war to defend Ukraine, nor should we. But how you negotiate that particular issue is going to be difficult. We're probably going to zero in on trying to make a distinction between long-range offensive strike capabilities, which the Russians will oppose, and legitimate self-defense capabilities. But we're going to have to negotiate over, what's the difference between offense and defense? How do you define that? That's not an easy thing to do. We're going to have to do training and maintenance inside Ukraine. That will mean military forces on the ground. The Russians are going to ensure that they don't have combat capability. That's going to be a thorny negotiation. But what I do think is possible in the relatively near term is what I would call a framework deal, a deal in which the sides codify some fundamental compromises and lay out a negotiating agenda, a roadmap for nailing down these details. And once you get a framework deal in place and you accompany that with a ceasefire deal, which I do think is possible to pull off, you could probably do that in the next 3 or 4 months. bring this war onto a clear path toward resolution, and then work out the details of a broader peace agreement over time. Right now, I think that is conceivable. I think that's where the Trump administration is heading right now. And I think there are signs that Europe and Ukraine are starting to acknowledge that that's the best path forward for them too. So with that, let me wrap this up, and we can turn to questions that you might have about what I've said or any other issues that you'd like to raise.
You're muted, Paul.
Thanks, Cole. Sorry about that. So there's plenty there for us, obviously, to try to digest, and I'm sure people will have some good questions. Just before we go to questions, Cole, do you want to put up that form where people can actually sign up in support of negotiations and ceasefire?
Okay. So this is an action page that allows you to contact your members of Congress, telling them to support negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. So you can fill in your information here, and it will send it to it will look up your address, and it will send it to your House representative and your senators.
Great. So this would you'll put the link to it in the chat, Cole, so people can actually
Yes,
fill it out right now.
yes.
But you can't obviously fill it out on the screen right now. So if you go to the chat, if you agree with these sentiments, if you go to the chat and fill in the form, it will automatically go to your representatives in Congress, just to keep that idea of negotiations before them. So that would be great. So as you're doing that, I think we can get back to questions and answers. I think I see a lot of hands raised already. So can you take off the screen share, Cole, when you get a chance? Very good. And let's see what we have here for questions. Oh boy. Okay. Well, let's start at the top. Donald Smith. Donald, you
Yes,
can we
okay.
unmute you? Good.
So thank you very much for your talk, Mr. Beebe. You said that neither side wanted war. It was a security dilemma that they just fell into it. That seems far-fetched to me. The U.S. diplomats had warned multiple times that expanding NATO would lead to a war. The Rand Corporation recommended expanding into Ukraine and said, yeah, that will cause the war, we'll just have to deal with it. So, and the CIA engineered the coup, or at least helped strongly, and armed Azov militias. It's clear to me the US wanted to bait Russia into this war. Please comment on that.
Yeah, no, I don't think so, actually. I think this was a case of the United States believing its own rhetoric. We truly believe that NATO is a defensive alliance, that we didn't have any aggressive intent. The notion that we would want to attack Russia in any way, we regard it as folly, that this was Russian paranoia in its views of the United States and NATO and Western intentions more generally. And our belief all along was that the Russians would eventually come to their senses and recognize that their concerns about the so-called threat that NATO and the United States posed to Russia were, in fact, illusions. Now, I certainly blame the United States for enormous errors of judgment, for a profound inability to understand Russia's perspective on this. It was really a failure of strategic empathy. But I don't think we actually wanted a war. And in fact, I think we believed that the combination of deterrence and reassurance through diplomatic channels that we had no hostile intent would in fact cause the Russians to settle down and recognize that they weren't going to solve their problems through military force. I think obviously that failed, but I don't think it failed because we wanted a conflict. And I'll have to say, in all my time in government, and I was serving in government from the mid 1980s during the Cold War period, all the way through the war in Georgia. I saw no indications that we were anybody in the U.S. government actually wanted a war with Russia or is trying to bait Russia into that in any way.
Okay, thank you, Judge. Thank you, Don, for your question. A lot of people have that issue of concern. Let's go to Jeffrey Bachtel. Jeffrey, you have a question?
First off, it's Bark Dull. That's how you pronounce my last name. And secondly, I wanted to follow up on what Donald said. He's right. He's right about that. If only we made that if only we put the promise that to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand westward after the fall of above the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in writing, then all this probably could have been avoided. But for those in the Warsaw Pact, if they wanted to join NATO, then only the people could decide that, not the government, and they would have to vote for it. If you know what I mean. Do you think that could have prevented if history went that way? Do you think this war in Ukraine could have been avoided?
Yes, is the short answer. I do think that there were alternatives that were realistic for helping Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall that did not involve formal membership in NATO. Now, I think there were people in the U.S. government that at the time opposed NATO enlargement. Most of the people in the area of Soviet and Russian studies believed that expanding NATO was a mistake that was going to lead sooner or later to some sort of confrontation. Those voices were overruled. There were people in the Clinton administration when these decisions were being made that opposed this. Graham Allison, now at Harvard, then Assistant Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense at the time, Bill Perry, both strongly opposed NATO enlargement, both advocated a different approach to Eastern Europe called Partnership for Peace, which would have involved engagement with these countries, help to their military sectors, but not membership in the alliance. They strongly advocated that. They lost that debate inside the administration. Had they won, would we be in the situation that we're in right now? You can play lots of what-if games with history, but my belief is that we would very likely not be in the situation that we're in right now had we made a different decision back in the 90s.
Okay, thank you, Judge. Good question, Jeffrey. Let's go to Cheryl Spencer.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I don't think I heard you mention anything about George Soros and his possible influence in Ukraine as to what's been happening, or the oligarchs. We have oligarchs both on the side of Russia and on the side of Ukraine. Could you say, are they preventing any forward-looking negotiations because they stand to lose a bunch of money? Something like that? Thank you.
Well, on the issue of Soros, what I'll say is that there has, for many decades, been a large U.S. government effort carried out in partnership with non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to promote so-called democratic liberal reform in the states of the former Warsaw Pact and former Soviet Union. Now, this became entangled with this question of NATO enlargement in very destructive ways, because what happened essentially was that the U.S. government and the NGOs that it was funding allied themselves to groups that frequently were what I will call ethnic nationalists. In other words, groups that were trying to build new nations in place of what had been, communist regimes. In many cases, in countries that didn't have a long history of independence and didn't have a deep tradition of civic nationalism. And when you're trying to build a new state along nationalist grounds, one of the easiest things to do was to define your nationalism in opposition to Moscow, in opposition to Russia. What is a Ukrainian? How do I define what a Ukrainian nationalist is? Well, one of the easy ways is, we're not Russia, and we don't want to be ruled by Moscow. Now, many of those movements, at least use the rhetoric of democracy and Western liberal values. And so the United States said, these are Democrats, they're liberals, they're trying to build new independent states, let's support them. They also tended to be ethnic nationals with rather hostile attitudes toward Russia. Now, the Russians made this issue worse. Their own behavior exacerbated the feelings of insecurity, the resentments that had long historical bases in these countries toward Russia. Russia tried to intimidate them and bully them, which is very counterproductive and exacerbated these movements. But the Russians looked at what the United States was doing and essentially said, you're not funding Democrats. You're funding ethnic Russian, ethnic nationals who hate Russia. Why are you doing that? And this in turn got conflated with NATO enlargement and created an impression in Russia that the United States was fomenting anti-Russianism along Russia's periphery, and that we were doing so with hostile strategic intent, attempting to ring Russia with military allies that would in turn strangle Russia, threaten its security, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an issue that contributed greatly to an escalatory spiral. And it's part of the reason why I think that the issue that we're dealing with looks a lot more like World War I than World War II. We thought we were doing all this with good intentions. The Russians looked at the things we were doing and said, boy, this looks like bad intentions to us and something that is hostile and threatening to our interests. So there was a real perception gap that took place. Now, as for oligarchs, I think they are influential. They matter a lot inside Ukraine. The term oligarch is now anachronistic in Russia. What we once understood to be oligarchs, in other words, wealthy businessmen that had significant political clout and decision-making impact in Russia politically, that has not been the case for 20 years. Putin essentially neutered the oligarchs that had emerged from the 1990s. There are now, wealthy businessmen, but they do not have an independent political base, and they owe their continued wealth entirely to Putin and the Kremlin, who can take it away in an instant. This, again, is one of the flaws in the way the United States attempted to deal with Russia over the past several years, we thought we could put economic pressure on the oligarchs, who would in turn lean on Putin and say, "Hey, knock it off! You're impoverishing us." So end the war. It was a misunderstanding of the relationship between Putin and business in Russia, one that might have been true 25 years ago, but is now far from true.
Okay. Let's go. Thank you, Judge. Let's go to Michael Hoey.
My question is in regards to Russian arms exports. So up until about 5 years ago, it seems to me like Russia was number 2 in the export of planes and tanks and all that. And I'm wondering, after the war is over, how long will it take them to get back to number 2 or maybe even number 1? I guess if they're running production factories 24 hours a day now, so will it take them a while to get back? And second question related to that, is this war kind of showing off the quality of weapons? In other words, is it kind of like a living, way, an arms show in live? I mean, in what's it called?
Yeah.
I don't know what the term is.
Well, it's interesting. The United States has tended to produce high technology weapons, very expensive, in relatively low quantities. And the Russians have tended to produce what I would call, medium technology weapon systems in large numbers. And this war is really a clash between those two different approaches to military production and to war. We've tried to turn this war into a war of maneuver, a war where Ukraine could take advantage of America's 24/7, real-time intelligence, our targeting data, precision guided weaponry that would allow us to identify Russian vulnerabilities quickly and take advantage of them, strike them, almost instantly, and thereby break through Russian lines and overcome the quantitative advantages that the Russians have in this war. And they obviously greatly outnumber the Ukrainians, have much greater military industrial capacity. And that has not worked. So I think there was a period early in the war where it was possible to believe that Ukraine might be able to break through Russian lines. The Russians adapted, and they turned this war into a war of attrition that brings to bear the advantages that they have in their ability to mobilize much larger forces on the ground and to manufacture much greater quantities of artillery shells and missiles and other weapon systems in all of this. The Russians are out producing Ukraine, Europe, and the United States in artillery by a factor of at least 3 to 1 now. And their manpower advantages on the front lines range somewhere between 3 to 1 to 6 to 1 in their advantage. And there's really nothing that the United States and Ukraine and Europe can do about those numbers. We're not going to magically be able to create a larger Ukrainian population. We're not going to put boots on the ground and fight on Ukraine's behalf. And we're discovering that we cannot ramp up military production in Europe and the United States nearly as quickly as Russia has been able to. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. That's a whole talk in and of itself. But this is now a war in which superior scale is prevailing. Now, what kind of impact will that have on exports? States go in, there's a lot that go into decisions about whose arms you're going to purchase. The countries that believe that buying a few very expensive, very high technology U.S. weapon systems will secure them, I think have probably got to give that assumption a second thought. depending on who they might be fighting against. In some instances, that might make sense. In others, it might make no sense at all. You might want a military supplier that provides, medium technology that is fairly reliable, not that expensive, and that you can get in scale, depending on the circumstances you're facing. So I'm not sure there's a very clear answer to that question.
Okay, that's very interesting stuff. Next is Larry Quart. Larry?
Yes, thank you. Repeatedly, the United States has initiated negotiations and then launched decapitation strikes to kill the negotiators. They've done it multiple times. Foreign Minister Lavrov has characterized the US as agreement incapable. Why do you think that the Russians would actually seriously come to the table, knowing the past history of dealing with the perfidious United States? And one other thing, you didn't mention natural gas, and that's a really big factor in this conflict. The selling of expensive fracking-derived natural gas to Europe instead of cheaper Russian gas. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so why would Russia want to come to the table? And you're right, the Russians don't trust us, and they have real doubts with, I think, a lot of justification as to whether the United States is, as you put it, agreement capable or not. That said, the Russians do face a real dilemma. They can't solve their security problem just by winning the war in Ukraine. First of all, conquering all of Ukrainian territory is a formidable problem. To occupy a country of that size would require an occupation force many times larger than the entire Russian military, not just the entire Russian invasion force. They don't want to generate a military that's that big. That puts all kinds of burdens on the Russian economy and Russia politically that they would rather avoid. Secondly, that kind of an occupation army would certainly face robust guerrilla resistance. It would be bloody and costly. If nothing else, the United States and Europe will guarantee that it would be. And there are going to be a lot of Ukrainians that would be willing participants in that sort of endeavor. So the Russians recognize that that would be a real headache. I don't think they want it. Now, that aside, they've got themselves a NATO problem that they can't fix by winning the war in Ukraine. NATO is expanded. It's now doubled in size since the end of the Cold War, from 16 to 32 nations. In adding Finland, it added a very, very long border directly with Russia. And it's starting to rearm. The United States and Germany last year announced that they're going to put intermediate range missiles on German territory for the first time since Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF treaty that banned those missiles. Now, those missiles are coming back to Europe. That means that Russia has a big security issue, just like it had when the Pershing IIs were put in Germany in the early 1980s. You're talking about missiles of high accuracy with short flight times, warning times in Russia that mean, 5-6 minutes, which is, really problematic. This is a security threat that you can't fix by winning the war in Ukraine. You've still got a Europe, a NATO, that's likely to be rearming, not in the mood for arms control deals. If Russia won't compromise on Ukraine and find some sort of reasonable way forward, the political support in Europe and the United States for entering into arms control negotiation with Russia will be probably almost non-existent. The Russians know this. If they're going to have some sort of hope that they can secure themselves against NATO's nuclear and conventional capabilities, they're going to have to work that out at the negotiating table. And I think they recognize that a compromise over Ukraine is a prerequisite for those larger negotiations, and they want them. I think that's very clear. They've come right out and said that they want them. And I think that's one of the issues that we are talking to the Russians about behind the scenes right now. So, the incentives for Russia to come to the table really are, no, they don't trust us. Yes, they have deep concerns that we're not going to stick to our word, but the alternative looks worse. The alternative looks like a major security issue that they don't have any hope of resolving militarily.
Thank you, Judge. And how about the issue of liquefied natural gas and how that plays into the situation?
Well, it's a complex issue. Yes, the United States wants to sell LNG to Europe, of course, and LNG is, by its nature, more expensive than piped natural gas. So, from a strictly, self-serving economic point of view, we want continued markets for LNG in Europe. That said, it's really not in our strategic interest to drive Russian gas toward China. We do have to bear in mind the bigger chessboard that this is playing out on, and a situation where the United States basically pushes Russia and China to cooperate with each other much more deeply than they might otherwise, because the United States is essentially treating them both as hostile actors rather than attempting to normalize relations with Russia and make Russia, as a result, less dependent on China, with greater room for maneuver in the world. I think that is really the strategic part of this that is animating U.S. behavior. So, if you look narrowly at our economic interests in Europe, in energy markets, yeah, sure, we want to sell LNG. But when you look at our broader strategic issues and the role that energy plays on that bigger global chessboard, there are real reasons, I think, for us to want to see this war end and for some sort of rapprochement in the U.S.-Russian relationship to begin.
Okay, thanks very much. That's great. And thanks for the question. Artie McDonald, are you out there? Arthur, are you still with us? Can you unmute? He is out there, but he can't figure out.
I'm here. Am I here now?
Yeah, we hear you now.
All right. Thanks so much, Paul. And thank you, George. This may be a naive question, but George, when you were talking about negotiations, you talked only about the US, Trump, and Putin. Does Zelensky have no role in this at all? No input?
No, I would not say that at all. I think this is a war with two dimensions to it. The biggest and most important dimension is actually not between Russia and Ukraine. It's between Russia and the West, and primarily between Russia and the United States over these bigger European security issues. Now, Ukraine, unfortunately, has been caught in the middle of that bigger geopolitical tug of war. I think that's been tragic for Ukraine. And there are aspects of this conflict that the Ukrainians have to be involved in. In fact, they're the only ones that can negotiate a deal on some issues. One of those things is territory. The United States should not be negotiating over where the border between Ukraine and Russia lies. We should not be bargaining away Ukrainian territory. That is a matter of Ukraine's own sovereign decision-making. If Ukraine and Russia want U.S. facilitation on that issue, I wouldn't object to it. But fundamentally, that territorial issue is between Moscow and Kyiv to work out. There are other issues like the treatment of Russian minorities, Russian language inside Ukraine. That's essentially a bilateral issue between Ukraine and Russia, not something for the United States to negotiate over. Exchanges of prisoners of war, all of the things that have to be addressed to bring the fighting to an end, reparations of various kinds. But I think those are almost impossible to resolve unless that bigger geopolitical conflict is addressed. That's why I think the work that has been done between Washington and Moscow to try to settle that bigger geopolitical conflict is the first and most essential step that has to be taken. I think there is some real progress there. But ultimately, the Ukrainians are going to have to address those bilateral issues with Russia that only they can negotiate on.
Thanks, Judge. Just to jump onto that a second, would the extreme right-wing groups like Azov Battalion folks and other, groups that declare themselves to be kind of neo-Nazis, would they allow Zelensky to negotiate on those issues, or would they get rid of him?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that certainly has to be one of his concerns. If I were Zelensky, I would be very concerned about my right flank. And he was elected as a peace candidate in 2019. He ran on two platform points. The first was anti-corruption. The second was ending what was then that regional war in the Donbass with Russia. I think he failed at both. Part of the reason he failed in the peace bid with Russia was the far right, the patriotic militant part of the Ukrainian political spectrum, told Zelensky that if he made any kind of fundamental compromises with Russia, that they would ensure that his political career and probably his life were very short. So this is an issue he has to deal with. That said, I think part of the good things that have happened is Russia making public its approval of future Ukrainian EU membership is a big deal. That allows Zelensky to point to something concrete, an achievement that potentially could offer a bright future for Ukraine. So that in turn would allow him to portray opponents of a deal as people that are condemning Ukraine to probably a military defeat, probably perpetual frozen, conflict that does not allow Ukraine to be reconstructed, would be, I think, a death sentence for the country politically. And I think the United States could also help him with his far right problem. We have in the past very discreetly offered security help to heads of state that felt they were under threat from domestic groups, with intelligence, with Secret Service kind of help. That might be the kind of thing that would increase Zelensky's confidence that compromising with Russia on some things would not be his own death sentence. And then finally, I don't think a territorial compromise with Russia is necessary. And by that, I mean, I don't think to get a deal, I don't think he has to recognize Russian occupied territory as legally part of Russia. They can agree to disagree on this. Simply say, the military lines are what they are. Ukraine is not going to recognize this territory as Russian, but both sides agree we're not going to settle this issue on the battlefield, that this is an issue that will have to be resolved ultimately through diplomacy and political means. That kind of formula has worked in other cases. Obviously the Korean War still does not have a formal delineation of that border, but the fighting has ended. True in Cyprus, there are other instances of this as well. So I do think that that's possible, and that would, I think, help Zelensky feel confident that there may be room for him politically to end this war.
Great, thank you, Judge. Judge, we're taking up your whole evening here. Do we have time for another one or two questions?
Yeah, sure.
Great, so let's go to Dave Mulnix next. Dave?
Oopsie. Okay. Oops. Aloha. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your presentation and your wisdom. We really appreciate it. I'm a little baffled by that the United States wouldn't want to start a war. I mean, that's the history of the United States: the Mexican War, the Philippine War, the Spanish-American War. We started all those wars. The Vietnam War. We lied about the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf War. We lied about babies being taken out of incubators and put on the ground. The Iraq War. We lied about weapons of mass destruction. The United States started all those wars, and the war for Ukraine was they are attacking us unprovoked, which is completely against history. 30 years of the United States and Russia themselves saying, if you continue to expand NATO, we will end up in a war. Even Joe Biden. We know that Putin tried 3 times, I think, in 2021 to work this out, and Zelensky refused, and Biden refused. We know that in I think March, April of 2022, Putin tried one more time. Look, I don't want this war. We can walk away from it. And he actually had talked to Joe Biden on the December 2021, and they got on the phone together, and they said, hey, I don't want this war. Just keep Ukraine neutral. Don't join NATO, and we won't have to go to war. And what I want basically is an agreement for this area, a non-aggressive agreement. And Biden said yes. Apparently his handlers didn't like that. And by January, he comes and says, Ukraine's joining NATO no matter what. Reneging on what he had promised to Putin on the phone. And he sent weapons to Ukraine. Zelensky started shelling the Donbass. And he got his legislature to pass a legislation saying that they were going to retake Crimea if by this is my question and have him answer it.
No, it's a very interesting historical narrative, and it may be absolutely true, but I think we've got your point.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry.
What question follows from it?
That's my question, because that goes against what you were just saying. Plus, my other question is, 1980s, I was part of the nuclear freeze campaign, and Reagan did not want it, but Russia did, and Russia responded back, I'll do it. And they did a treaty after that. And so that kind of stopped the nuclear arms race for a while. So I think your idea is great, because Russia may put forward a way to come to a peace agreement here, because it happened in 1980s. So it's possible again. So that was my question. With all that history, how can you say we stumbled into that war?
Yeah, no,
sorry about that.
Question. Good, thank you.
Well, look, I'm not going to dispute that there are times that the United States has started wars. There are many of those instances, of course. I think in this one, we didn't actually want to go to war with Russia. I think we wanted to deter Russia, but not compromise over the core issue that the Russians were insisting we compromise over, which was NATO. And my understanding was not that Biden and Putin actually agreed on this issue on the phone. If you'll recall, and I think if you go back and look at the video history, Biden was asked about this, and he stood on the White House lawn, and he asked whether he had respected Russia's red line on Ukrainian membership in NATO. And I think his exact words were, I don't respect anybody's red line on this. In other words, I think the United States was not willing to compromise on an issue that the Russians themselves said was critical from their point of view to Russia's security. Now, I think we did so believing that this would not result in an invasion and a potentially direct military clash between the United States and Russia. I think we erred greatly in believing that we could simply continue to insist that this was not an issue for discussion. The Russians were for a long time signaling that this issue had to be resolved either at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. And I don't think we took them seriously, and we should have.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for those all those points, Dave. Thanks very much. Thank you, Judge. And maybe we could take one, if Ray Sullivan, if you have one quick final question for Judge, that would be great. Gray.
Yeah, I'm from New Zealand, and a little country that thinks itself independent. But when the war started, we swallowed the idea that the war was completely unprovoked, and it is still our policy. And I believe it's something that many people still accept, and that we've demonized Putin for a lot of reasons. I'm not sure how many of them are valid or not. You refer to our their lack of trust in us, and we've got an intense lack of trust in Putin. Can you tell? And then we're relying on Trump as a key negotiator. How can anybody trust him? We've got intense lack of trust. How can we negotiate under those sorts of circumstances?
Yeah, this question comes up a lot. Putin can't be trusted, Trump can't be trusted. There's no question that there is a profound lack of trust on both sides. It's mutual. And there are good reasons, I think, on both sides for that lack of trust. That said, you don't pursue a negotiation like this trusting that the other side is going to engage in good faith because they're good people, that it's the right thing to do, that they're virtuous. What you do, however, is apply what was first a Russian slogan that Ronald Reagan adopted, trust but verify. And you trust the other side to adhere to its own self-interests. In other words, you fashion a deal that both sides see as in their own interest to uphold, because it's worse than the alternative, and the things that they really most care about, the things that they regard as vital, are addressed in the deal. So that's the trust part of it. And then you verify, you build into this agreement provisions for monitoring compliance with the terms, and you build in a mechanism for addressing what will inevitably be controversies and disputes over implementing the deal. That always happens. You put in place a mechanism for working out those compliance issues. And I do think that is possible. I think, if we think we're going to get a deal that the Russians don't like, and we're going to force it down their throats, and they're going to adhere to it, we're mistaken. That we've tried doing that. We tried doing that after World War I, right? with Germany. That worked out quite poorly. Those instances in history where we have attempted to integrate our opponents into a post-war deal. Japan and Germany after World War II. France after the Napoleonic Wars and the victorious powers in Europe worked to integrate France into the concert of Europe. Those have worked out well. And I think those lessons are lessons we should apply this time. The Russians need to be integrated into a European security framework in ways that they believe address their core interests and give them an incentive to adhere to the terms of a deal. And then you verify.
Great, thanks. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for some good questions tonight. Thanks for everyone for participating. And George, especially thank you for your wisdom on these difficult issues. I hope somewhere down the line we'll be able to check in again with you on where this whole negotiating process stands at that time. So again, thank you very much for your time and for your analysis and for being with us this evening.